I'm a dog lover through and through. And like most folks, that all started with my childhood pup. You see, I was an only child who spent a lot of time alone, usually with my nose in a comic book. My grandma thought I needed a companion, so she got me my first dog, Mitzi. I know everyone says their dog is their best friend, but Mitzi really was mine. She was a collie, like Lassie, the famous TV dog of the 60s and 70s. And I was her Timmy, albeit black and a lot bigger than the kid on the show. I used to wish bad things would happen in my neighborhood just so she and I could save the day. But not all dogs are heroes, and there will only be one Mitzi. Each canine has its own personality, and just like us, there are bad apples. Now don't get me wrong, I think all animals deserve a chance. Some of the best pets I've known have come from the street or the pound. But there's something about a dog with a mysterious past. They could be a lover or a killer. Or in the case of today's episode, not a dog at all. It just wants you to think it is. You're listening to Run Fool. I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 29, Skinwalkers, Part 1. The story I'm about to tell came from my buddy Lee. He was a camera operator for a television show I was working on years back. When I saw him at lunch hunched over a paperback of Stephen King's Pet Sematary, I knew we'd be friends. Lee was a voracious reader of all things horror, but he insisted nothing he read came close to what he'd experienced as a teenager. It all happened while he was working on his grandfather's ranch in Arizona, Navajo land to be specific. Something unspeakable was unleashed that summer. Something Lee told me I may not understand, and neither did the poor souls who set it loose. By the time Todd and Jaya crossed the border to Navajo Nation, it was already dusk. Their flight from Maine had been delayed, and now Jaya was sure they were going to be late. The dude ranch where they were staying was strict about check-in. Their email had said no later than 6:30 p.m., all caps, bolded. But Tom insisted they'd stop for food. In their nearly 10 years of marriage, Jaya learned that when her husband was hungry, he'd commit crimes for a french fry. So she relented. But as they rolled down the main street of the nearest town, they found everything was closed. Every business was locked up and empty. Even the gas station attendant was flipping over its open sign as they pulled in. Todd slumped in the driver's seat, defeated. Maybe it's a holiday, Jaya shrugged. So they drove on. As the sky darkened, the streets got emptier and emptier until they were the only ones on the road. Everyone, it seemed, was home. Jaya was glad everything was closed. Missing their check-in was making her anxious. But as she watched the old woman stare at them through the windows and draw the curtains, Jaya's anxiety turned to dread. At 7 p.m., Jaya and Todd rolled up the gravel path to the ranch. Todd let out a long whistle. Man, talk about scenery. The desert was bathed in a purple, dusky light, casting dark shadows from the canyon across the desert floor. Above them, a ghostly moon already hung in the blue-black sky. But Jaya wasn't soaking up the views. She was busy dialing the ranch's main line, praying they'd pick up, when someone stepped outside. It was an older Navajo man, his dark gray hair pulled into a ponytail. He introduced himself as Woody, the ranch's owner. Seconds later, the screen door slammed and a teenager walked out. My friend, the camera op. He was 16 and a whole lot skinnier, wearing a death metal t-shirt. As she shook his hand, Jaya noticed the chipped black polish on the teen's fingernails. "This is Lee," Woody said gruffly, "my grandson." Jaya apologized for their late arrival, but Woody just raised a hand, brushing away the apology, and nodded to Lee. The teen immediately got to work carrying their bags. Woody led the couple to a tin-roofed shack and ushered them inside. The lodgings were old but clean. An ominous-looking cow skull was mounted on the wood walls. The thing didn't even have eyes. But still, Jaya felt like it was glaring at her. Lee swiftly unloaded their bags as Woody explained the next day's schedule. Just then, an eerie cry cut the silence. A coyote. Woody froze, then nodded to Lee. The teen handed Jaya a stack of towels and hurried out the door. "Sleep well," Woody muttered. "Good night," Todd replied, but the men were already gone. Jaya crossed her arms and turned to Todd. "I told you we couldn't stop for food. They were pissed we were late." Todd let out another long whistle. "I don't know. Whatever that was, I don't think it was about us." The next morning, Jaya made sure they were at breakfast at 9 a.m. sharp. After last night's rush check-in, it was clear their hosts were big on timeliness. But the last thing Jaya wanted to do was mess up their trip. Or really, Todd's trip. They were there for his 40th. The ranch was sprawling with herds of sheep, a horse stable, and even cattle. But Todd was most excited about the dogs. They were working animals, but Todd treated them like puppies. He'd get down on his knees and go full baby talk, letting the canine lick his entire face. Jaya would watch on half cringing, half smiling. She loved this side of him, but some of the things she loved most about Todd were also what made them opposites. Todd was from Minnesota. He grew up camping and was comfortable in the outdoors, not to mention around dogs. He had a few as a kid. Jaya, meanwhile, was raised in a city apartment with immigrant parents who didn't like pets in the house, dogs especially. But Jaya soon learned Americans were obsessed with them. There was old Yella and Benji, and you already know my personal favorite, Lassie. But Jaya never really got the whole dog thing. Todd loved all animals, and it's like they knew. Every species seemed to be drawn to him. Jaya called him Snow White. He also had this annoying ability to be good at anything he tried. For the next 5 days, whether it was horseback riding or learning to lasso, Todd was a natural. Meanwhile, Jaya struggled just to get in the saddle. But Todd was always patient and encouraging. And even though she was way out of her element, Jaya did it all for Todd. You see, he'd had a rough few months. That May, he'd lost his job. No one saw it coming. Who cans public school teachers? But then again, Todd taught photography. And between the death of film and the school's dwindling arts budget, he hardly stood a chance. He needed this. And it was worth it for Jaya to see him thrive. Plus, Todd and Lee had hit it off. After a decade of teaching high school, Todd knew how to talk to the most stoic of teens. Before long, he was showing Lee how to shoot 35mm. They went everywhere on the ranch or the trail taking photos. Jaya had to admit it was beautiful, but as the sun went down, her optimism sank too, until it became a familiar pit in her stomach, dread. It seemed like the people on the ranch felt it too. While the atmosphere during the day was light, the evenings were different. Dinner was always at 5 p.m. sharp, and everyone always turned in around dusk. Todd chalked this up to just ranch rules. After all, they weren't at a Holiday Inn. There was no 24-hour service here. Jaya knew he was probably right, but it still didn't explain that weird sense of dread she got after dark. Nothing did, until their last day. That night, Jaya awoke to a symphony of odd disturbances. Outside, the wind had kicked up, howling past the cabin. The usually placid cattle were making strange distress calls. And further in the distance, the ranch dogs were barking up a storm. And through it all, Todd snored softly beside her, peaceful as a baby. Jaya sighed and buried her head in her pillow when she heard a low thump. She shot up in bed just as heavy steps ran across the roof and shook Todd awake. "There's something on the roof," she hissed. Todd turned over, muttering that it was just a raccoon. Jaya gave him a shove. She was serious. There was something out there. Todd let out an exasperated sigh and sat up. He didn't hear anything, he said. As soon as the words left his lips, there was a noise at the door. Something was scratching to get in. Jaya felt every hair stand up on her neck. As Todd stood, she grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. "Don't open it." Todd squeezed her hand. "Come on, Jay. How often do I get to do something macho?" He winked at her and strode across the room. Jaya's heart pounded in her ears as he cracked open the door. Todd went stiff. Jaya held her breath until she heard him laugh. "It's a dog." If Jaya had let him, Todd would have brought the dog inside. But instead, he left a bowl of water on the cabin porch, and to his delight, the canine was still there in the morning. It was a skinny thing with narrow hips and an almost feral look to it. Jaya would have thought it was a large coyote if it wasn't for the fur. It had odd markings for a wild animal. A dark stripe ran from its forehead down its muzzle and circled around its eyes, almost like a mask. The effect made its light green eyes look even more intense. The way it acted, Todd figured it had been around people. It knew how to scratch at the door looking for help, but there was no collar. That's when Jaya knew she was in trouble. Todd immediately made his case. He'd wanted a dog all his adult life, and this one found him. It was like destiny, like it chose them. It was a big ask. Hell, a kitten would have felt big, never mind a feral desert mutt. But as she watched Todd ruffle its fur, she realized she hadn't seen him this excited for months. She wanted to be supportive, and she could learn to love dogs, right? Everyone else did. How hard could it be? As they went to check out, the dog followed without coaxing. Woody and Lee were already waiting on the porch. "I think I found my spirit animal," Todd beamed. Jaya winced. By the look on Woody's face, Todd's joke hadn't gone over well. The old man crossed his arms over his chest, eyes narrowed as Todd told him about the dog. Woody squinted at the canine through the glaring sun. "I know all the strays on my property, but I'm not sure about that one." With that, he walked over for a better look, and Lee followed. When the old man stopped dead in his tracks, Jaya watched his eyes grow wide, and Woody threw his arm in front of Lee, keeping his grandson from moving closer. Todd continued, oblivious. "If it's not yours, we're thinking we might adopt the fella." The rancher didn't answer. He was still staring at the dog, a strange look frozen on his face, half surprise, half awful recognition. Jaya chimed in. "If that's all right with you, of course." "Yes," he muttered. "Yes, please take it." Behind him, Lee began to protest. "Grandpa?" Woody shot the teenager a look and said something sharp to him in a language Jaya assumed was Navajo. They exchanged a few tense words, and the conversation ended with Lee staring at his feet. Woody turned back to the couple. "Take your spirit animal, and don't bring it back." As they flew home, Jaya couldn't get the interaction out of her head. Afterward, Lee had apologized. His grandpa didn't mean to be harsh, Lee explained nervously. He was just old school. To Woody, res dogs weren't house dogs. They were just dirty mutts. But Jaya had watched Woody's face. She didn't think he was just being callous. Something about the dog had rattled him. He seemed almost afraid. Before they left, Lee gave him his phone number. "Keep in touch," he insisted, "and be safe." Jaya thought that was a strange send-off from a teenager. The dog had spent the entire trip beneath the plane. When they landed in Maine, they learned another dog, a chocolate lab, had died during the flight. It was awful. No one could explain why. But Todd and Jaya were grateful their pup was okay. The first thing they did when they took him home was give him a bath and a name. They settled on Salty for his gray salt and pepper fur and got him a collar with his new moniker emblazoned on a silver tag. Then they took him to his very first dog park. They were excited to see him mingle with the other suburban pups. But once they unleashed him, the other dogs scattered, cowering at the perimeter of the park. The owners threw dirty looks at Jaya and Todd. They never brought him back. Todd mused it must have been because Salty wasn't neutered. Neutered dogs acted weird around the ones that were still intact, he said. But still, Todd refused to get him fixed. "What kind of person chops off their friend's balls?" he said. Jaya just rolled her eyes. Men. But she didn't think what happened at the park was because Salty was intact. Something else was going on. And as the weeks passed, she noticed more odd things about Salty. For starters, he never barked. In fact, he hardly made any noise. But somehow Todd always knew what he needed. Todd bragged that they had a psychic connection, but it really seemed to Jaya that Salty had him trained, not the other way around. Todd would let Salty anywhere, the couch, at the table while they ate dinner. He even let him off leash on their walks, citing how well behaved he was. But the one place Jaya put her foot down was their bedroom. Jaya lingered as she brushed her teeth, and when she was sure Todd had turned in, she slipped in the bedroom and locked the door. Inside, it was already dark. She assumed Todd was already asleep, but as she climbed into bed, he snuggled close. "Thought you'd wait me out, huh?" he teased. Jaya laughed. She wouldn't dream of it. Then his arms were around her waist, and his lips on her neck. It felt good to be close. Ever since they came back from Arizona, Todd had felt distant, his focus always on the dog. But now, Todd was all hers. Now, if you think I'm going to get into the details, you've come to the wrong place. This is a horror podcast, not a smut show. I'll just say things got hot and heavy from there. Between Todd's mouth on her ear and her own heavy breathing, Jaya was lost in the moment. But then, just by chance, she opened her eyes. In the corner of the dark room sat a shadow. Jaya squinted, unsure of what she was looking at. It turned, and two red-white orbs stared at her from the dark. Jaya screamed. Todd shot up and flicked on the light. There, sitting just a few feet away, was Salty. Todd collapsed against the headboard and laughed. The dog patted over, tail wagging, and Todd scratched his ears. "What are you doing in here, you little pervert? You figure out how to open the door?" Jaya sat frozen. But I locked it." Todd looked at her. "You what?" Jaya didn't know what to say. She looked away, her gaze landing on Salty. The dog watched her closely, his pale green eyes glinting in the lamplight, almost like he was waiting for her reply. Todd sighed. He knew she didn't want Salty in the bedroom, but she didn't have to lock the door. Jaya pointed at the canine. Then how did he get in? Todd shrugged. She must have thought she locked it and forgotten. Jaya shook her head. No, she knew she did. Todd led Salty out of the room. "He's a dog, Jay, not Houdini." Todd got back into bed and turned off the light. But as Jaya rolled over to sleep, a shadow moved beneath the bedroom door, and the jingle of a collar faded down the hall. After that night, Jaya decided to start fresh. She was going to give Salty a chance. For Todd. She started making a point of taking him on walks solo. She bought him chew toys and bones. You know, dog stuff. But Salty couldn't have been less interested. Todd said he was just too smart for all that. He joked that having Salty wasn't like having a dog as much as a roommate. Jaya had to agree. His behavior was just so human-like. The most dog-like thing about him was the way he stalked the neighbor's cat, Bella. Every time they let Salty in the backyard, he'd head straight to where the cat sat perched on the fence. Bella would hiss, back arched. But Salty, he'd just sit there, staring. It's like he enjoyed taunting the thing. Jaya kept telling herself that Salty's odd behavior was nothing but harmless quirks. But their neighbor, Mrs. Ingman, wasn't as forgiving. Mrs. Ingman claimed Salty was aggressive toward her beloved cat. How a dog that never made a noise could be aggressive, Jaya wasn't sure. But they were used to Mrs. Ingman's complaints. Last summer, their hostas were growing into her yard. The winter before, Christmas lights were too bright. Todd had tried to win her over in the beginning, but Mrs. Ingman was immune to his Midwest charm. It drove Todd nuts. But for Jaya, it was oddly satisfying. Todd had a way of moving through the world with ease. People always liked him. He was grounded, funny, kind. That's what drew Jaya to him in the first place. But while Todd had a breezy, devil-may-care attitude, she was the worrier, the overthinker. Jaya liked that they balanced each other, but at the same time she felt a tinge of resentment. Once Todd lost his job, that feeling grew. It wasn't the layoff. That wasn't his fault. It was that it brought the differences between them into even starker relief. While Jaya worked long hours, Todd kept breezing by. He decided to use the layoff to focus more on his photography, and Jaya was encouraging. But that fall, he hardly filled a roll of film. When Jaya asked him what he'd been doing all day, he always seemed dazed. He'd just been hanging with Salty, he'd say. The time just got away from him. Anytime Jaya pointed out this pattern, Todd got defensive. So she bit her tongue and her resentment grew. and soon a creeping thought told her that somehow Salty was responsible. Logically, Jaya knew that was ridiculous. Salty hadn't done anything wrong, at least nothing she could actually explain. But then, Bella the cat went missing. Mrs. Ingman put flyers everywhere, stop signs, street lamps, over other lost pet posters. Anywhere you went in the neighborhood, Bella's fuzzy little face glowered back. Jaya felt for Mrs. Ingman. Underneath all the gripes and bitterness, she knew the older woman was just lonely. And now, her beloved cat was gone. One morning, Jaya and Todd were eating breakfast when a blood-curdling scream came from next door. The two rushed over to find Mrs. Ingman in her backyard, staring frozen at the fence. There, speared on a post, was Bella's bloody, severed head, eyes still wide in terror. Mrs. Ingman turned and pointed a trembling finger at Salty, her voice dripping with venom. "That mongrel did this," she spat. "It's evil, and I'm gonna prove it if it kills me." The weeks after were hell. Mrs. Ingman harassed them day and night with letters, phone calls. She began spreading rumors about Salty, claiming he was a danger to the neighborhood. She even threatened to get the police involved to put him down. Jaya knew it was an empty threat. Salty had never growled at anything, let alone murder it. But still, the image of that poor cat haunted her thoughts, and so did Mrs. Ingman's words. They were washing dishes one night as Salty observed them from the kitchen mat. Todd once again was going off about Mrs. Ingman. He'd always taken her antics in stride, but once she targeted Salty, Jaya's easygoing husband became vicious. It was karma that Bella got mauled, Todd ranted. She'd had it out for Salty from the beginning. He wished the old crone was just dropped dead already. Jaya shot him a look. "What?" he said defensively. "The woman wants to kill our dog. We should be suing." Suing would only make things worse, Jaya said. Plus, they didn't know for sure that it wasn't Salty. Todd turned off the water and stared at her. She didn't actually believe that. Jaya didn't want to, she said, but they had to be real. They knew nothing about Salty's history before they found him. He was practically wild. Jaya went quiet. "There's something wrong with him, Todd." Todd slammed down a dish, making her jump. "God damn it, Jaya, why can't you leave a good thing alone?" Jaya froze. She was always picking at things, Todd spat, looking for flaws just to validate her sick paranoia. Jaya's jaw dropped. She'd never seen Todd so angry with her, but soon all that resentment came pouring out. He was the reason she was paranoid, Jaya hissed. While he got to live his life swaggering around carefree, she was the one worrying for the both of them, and she was sick of running damage control. Jaya stood, still buzzing with anger. She was almost proud of herself, until Todd spun around and stormed out the front door. Todd slept on the couch that night. The next morning, Jaya woke up early to make breakfast. She even fried up extra bacon for Salty and apologized. Todd did too. The stress from the Mrs. Ingman ordeal was getting to him. To both of them. Jaya agreed. But if living next door to her had taught them anything, before long she'd be on to the next complaint. Todd chuckled. We can only hope. Things went better after that, and like Jaya predicted, Mrs. Ingman had seemed to move on. For now. The calls stopped and so did the angry texts. Things were actually peaceful, but Jaya didn't want to tempt fate. She spent that Sunday afternoon trimming back their hostas, lest they sneak over to Mrs. Ingman's side of the fence. Jaya stood to stretch her aching back when she saw the old woman through the window, just sitting there. Jaya could only see her silhouette, but she could feel her snooping. Jaya waved. The gall this lady had. But Mrs. Ingman didn't move. Jaya froze, then waved again. Nothing. A strange feeling grew in the pit of her stomach. She leaned over the fence for a better look. Jaya shaded her eyes, squinting into the back window, and screamed. Todd was the one who called the police. It wasn't until they arrived that Jaya had calmed down enough to describe what she'd seen. Mrs. Ingman was sitting at her back window, with 2 knitting needles stabbed through each eye. Her mouth gaped open in a frozen scream. The cops had questions, and so did Todd and Jaya. But the officer they spoke to was tight-lipped. He only assured them that foul play was unlikely. When Jaya asked how he was so certain, he explained that there was no forced entry and no way for anyone to get in, just the cat door. That night, Jaya couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the bloodied, seeping sockets of Mrs. Ingman's face appeared behind her eyelids. A storm was brewing in Jaya's head, a building pressure of all the tiny nagging thoughts she'd pushed down again and again, too afraid to look at them too closely, because once she pieced them together, she knew they'd formed something too strange, too terrifying to cope with, and there'd be no coming back. So she brushed them aside for one more night, and finally, Jaya drifted to sleep. But if she'd opened her eyes, she would have known there was no use, because the thing she feared, it was already there. Its long silhouette filled the bedroom window, draped in furs and shadow, branching antlers scraping against the glass. It watched Jaya with a predator's gaze, two glowing orbs peering from the dark. Then it turned from the window and shrank onto four legs, its collar jingling as it moved into the night. It would be back, but not until the next episode of Run, Fool! Run, Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Alex Garland and produced by Abakar Adan and Lee Mengistu. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman, and artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producers at Will Media are Will Malnati and Rosie Guerin. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.